On the afternoon of the 6th of July 1995, a delegation of executives from Seoul walked into a low brick office building in Glenview, Illinois, and signed the papers that ended the American television industry. It had taken them 4 years to get there. They had bought their first shares in 1991, 5%, quietly, through a broker. They had increased their stake in 1993. Now they were buying the rest. The price, for what remained of the last American-owned television manufacturer, was approximately $351 million. The company was called Zenith Electronics Corporation. It had been founded in a Chicago workshop in 1918 by 2 amateur radio operators. It had employed, at its peak in 1966, more than 36,000 people. It had made, over the course of 77 years, tens of millions of radios and televisions in factories spread across the American Midwest. On that summer afternoon in 1995, it stopped being an American company. It would keep making televisions in the United States for 3 more years, then that would stop as well. The last plant, in Melrose Park, Illinois, would be closed in 1998. The building, 1.4 million square feet, would stand empty for 5 years and then be demolished. The site is now a shopping center. There is, so far as any public record shows, no monument at the location, no marker, no plaque. The men and women who had worked the picture tube line for 40 years walked out of the building for the last time and drove home. Most of them did not find comparable work again. These facts sound invented. They are not. One American plant would keep its lights on until 1998, the last one. One court case, argued for 16 years, would end at the Supreme Court in a 5-4 defeat that changed American antitrust law. One commander, dead since 1958, would be remembered by the men who worked the line as the reason any of it had ever existed at all. This is the story of the last American television factory, and of the company that built it, and of the country that could not, in the end, keep it. It is the story of a Chicago workshop in 1918, and a boardroom in Seoul in 1995, and of the 77 years in between. If any of this holds your attention, please consider subscribing. The channel lives on your patience with slow stories, and this is a slow story. All right, let us begin. It begins on the northwest side of Chicago, in a workshop that no longer exists, in the last summer of the First World War. The 2 young men who founded Zenith did not at the time think they were founding anything at all. Their names were Ralph Matthews and Carl Hassel. They were amateur radio operators, licensed by the federal government under the call sign 9ZN. And in the summer of 1918 they were building radio receivers by hand in a small workshop on the north side of Chicago. The address has been given differently in different accounts. What is not in dispute is that the operation was small, that it consisted of the 2 men and whatever help they could recruit, and that the receivers they built were sold by mail order to other amateur operators, one at a time, for prices that varied with the components available that week. The name Zenith came directly from the call sign. 9ZN was pronounced, in the way amateur operators of the period read their letters aloud, as 9ZN, and the men had begun signing their receivers with the letters Zenith, later Zenith, as a kind of maker's mark. It was not at first a company name. The company did not yet exist. What existed was 2 amateurs, a workshop, a mailing list of a few hundred other amateurs, and a product for which the total American market was, in the summer of 1918, perhaps a few thousand units a year. Amateur radio in that period was the province of tinkerers. There was almost no commercial broadcasting in the United States before 1920. There were no networks, no advertisers, no stations that ran a full schedule. The federal government had, for the duration of the war, banned civilian radio transmission altogether. Matthews and Hassel were building for men who mostly built their own equipment and who bought a manufactured set the way a carpenter might buy one particular chisel, because it was better made than the one he could make himself. The customers were serious. The market was tiny. What changed the market, and what would eventually change the workshop into a corporation, was a decision made in 1920 by the federal government to allow civilian broadcasting again, and a decision made in 1921 by a Chicago businessman named Eugene F. McDonald Jr. to invest in Matthews and Hassel's small operation. The businessman would take control of the company within 2 years. The workshop would be gone within 5, replaced by a factory on Iron Street. Neither Matthews nor Hassel would run the company they had founded. Both would remain associated with it, in advisory roles, for decades. Neither would ever again do what they had been doing that summer, which was building radio receivers by hand for other amateurs. The company they had accidentally founded was about to become something they had not. In 1918, imagined a company could become. Its president, when he arrived, would arrive with ideas about the future of American broadcasting that neither Matthews nor Hassel would have recognized as belonging to their industry. His name was Eugene F. McDonald Jr. He would call himself, for the rest of his life, the Commander. Eugene F. McDonald Jr. was born in Syracuse, New York, in 1886. By the time he arrived at Zenith in 1921, he was 35 years old, and he had already made and lost a small fortune in the used car business in Chicago, having pioneered the practice of selling used automobiles on the installment plan. A financial arrangement that was, in 1918, considered slightly disreputable. He had served in the United States Navy Reserve during the First World War, and he insisted, for the remainder of his life, on being addressed by his naval rank. He was, by every account that has come down, a difficult man. He was also, by every account that has come down, an unusually far-sighted one. MacDonald saw, in the small mail-order radio operation he had bought into, something that Matthews and Hassel had not seen. He saw that the crystal set in the amateur's workshop was about to become the radio in every American parlor, and that the company that built the best of those radios would, within a decade, become one of the largest consumer goods manufacturers in the country. He incorporated the Zenith Radio Corporation in 1923. He made himself president. He would run the company for the next 35 years, until his death in 1958. The Commander's method, as it emerged over the 1920s and 1930s, was consistent enough that his employees eventually reduced it to a single phrase. "The quality goes in," he said, "before the name goes on." He meant it operationally. Every Zenith set was to be built to a standard that would allow it to be repaired in the field 20 years later. Every component was to be specified above the minimum tolerance required for the design. Every finished set was to be tested before it left the plant, and any set that failed was to be rebuilt, not shipped as a second. This method was expensive. It also, over the course of the 1920s, made Zenith sets famous among a certain kind of American consumer. The kind who could afford to pay somewhat more than the market price for a product that was known to last. The Commander pushed the engineers hard. In 1924, Zenith built what has been widely described as the first portable radio, a suitcase-sized wooden box with its own batteries and its own aerial. In 1926, push-button tuning. In 1927, the first home radio designed to plug directly into the electrical mains, eliminating the batteries that had been, until then, standard equipment. In 1939, the Radio Nurse, a two-piece device with a microphone in the nursery and a speaker in the parlor, designed by the industrial designer Isamu Noguchi and now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It was, by any reasonable definition, the first commercial baby monitor. Where Matthews and Hassel had built for tinkerers, the Commander built for the country. The mail-order catalogue was replaced by 1928 by a dealer network in every state. The workshop was replaced by 1930 by a factory that employed several thousand workers. The commander himself became, over the course of the 1930s and 40s, one of the most publicly quoted businessmen in the American radio industry. He argued in print with David Sarnoff of Urca about the correct business model for broadcasting. He funded polar expeditions. He kept a boat, a former Navy icebreaker called the Mizpah, moored in Chicago Harbor, and conducted much of the company's business from its wood-paneled saloon. He believed and said that the correct business model for broadcasting was subscription, not advertising, and he spent 30 years and a considerable amount of Zenith's money trying to prove it with a pay television system called PhoneVision. PhoneVision, in the commander's lifetime, never worked. He never stopped. By 1955, 3 years before his death, Zenith was the second largest radio manufacturer in the United States and among the largest television manufacturers. The commander was 69 years old. He had built the company on one principle. He had never departed from it. Whether the principle would survive him was a question that would be answered slowly over the following 40 years. Zenith came late to television. Urca had begun commercial broadcasts in 1939. CBS had launched a color system, mechanical and eventually declared incompatible with existing sets, in 1950. Zenith did not put a television set on the market until 1948. The delay was deliberate. The commander had wanted to see the technology settle before committing the company's capital, and he had been right to wait. The first Zenith television, launched in the autumn of 1948, cost several $100s, which was more than a good used car. It sold anyway. It sold because it was better made than most of what was then on the market, and because Zenith's dealer network, built up over 25 years of radio sales, was already in place. The Melrose Park plant, in the western suburbs of Chicago, was opened in 1948 to make picture tubes for the new television line. It would grow, over the next 2 decades, into the largest single manufacturing facility Zenith ever operated. The building was expanded 3 times in the 1950s and twice more in the 1960s. At its peak, in the mid-1960s, it employed several thousand workers on multiple shifts, and it produced the picture tubes not only for Zenith's own sets, but, under contract, for a number of other American television manufacturers as well. The peak employment figure has been given differently in different accounts and should be verified against Zenith's own corporate records. What is not in dispute is that the plant was very large, that the workforce was substantial, and that the operation was, for its period, the state-of-the-art in American cathode ray tube manufacturing. The color television arrived at Zenith in 1961. Urca had established the color standard over the preceding decade, and Zenith, having initially opposed the standard and lost that fight in the regulatory arena, adopted it. The Zenith color set, when it came, was better than the Urca set on the market at that time. This was not marketing. The picture tubes, made at Melrose Park, were built to closer tolerances. The chassis, which Zenith called the hand-crafted chassis, was hand-wired point-to-point rather than assembled on a printed circuit board, on the theory that hand-wiring was more reliable in the field and easier to repair. The repairmen, who serviced these sets in American living rooms through the 1960s, largely agreed. Consumers, who did not know the technical difference between a hand-wired chassis and a printed circuit board, bought Zenith sets on the recommendation of the repairman. By 1966, Zenith was the #1 seller of color televisions in the United States. The commander's principle had held for 8 years past his death. The company employed roughly 36,000 people, almost all of them in the United States. It operated plants at Melrose Park for picture tubes, at Rowland in the western suburbs for shadow masks, at multiple locations in Chicago for final assembly, and at facilities in Iowa and Missouri for cabinets and speakers. The Chicago operation alone employed several thousand workers. Then the first ships arrived from Japan. The first Japanese televisions to arrive in the United States in commercial quantity came off container ships at the port of Long Beach and the port of Los Angeles in the mid-1960s. They were small, black and white, 13-inch table models sold in the American market under the brand names Sony and Panasonic and Sharp and Toshiba. On the American showroom floor, they were substantially cheaper than comparable American-made sets. The Japanese sets, according to trade press reporting from the period and to subsequent Treasury Department investigations, were being sold in the United States for less than they were being sold for in Tokyo. In some cases, according to the investigators, they were being sold in the United States for less than the cost of the components that went into them. This is called dumping. It has been illegal under United States law, in one form or another, since the Anti-Dumping Act of 1921. The theory of the statute is straightforward. A foreign manufacturer, subsidized by his own government or by an agreement among his domestic competitors, can sell below cost in a foreign market for as long as he can bear the losses, drive the local producers of the same goods out of business, and then, having captured the market, raise his prices to whatever the traffic will bear. The Anti-Dumping Act was designed to prevent this by imposing duties equal to the difference between the export price and the fair market value of the goods in the country of origin. Whether Japanese television manufacturers were in fact engaged in dumping between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s remains a matter of some debate among trade historians. Zenith, at the time, had no doubt. In 1970, Zenith filed a formal anti-dumping complaint with the United States Treasury Department. The department investigated for 5 years. In 1975, it ruled in Zenith's favor, and it began the process of assessing duties against the Japanese manufacturers. The duties, in the end, were largely not collected. The Treasury Department, under pressure from the State Department, which was in the middle of a series of delicate trade negotiations with the government of Japan, entered into a sequence of settlement agreements with the Japanese manufacturers, waiving most of the accumulated duties in exchange for pledges of future compliance with American law. The total amount of duties eventually collected, out of an assessment that had at one point been very substantial, was a small fraction of the original figure. The numbers have been given differently in different accounts and should be verified against Treasury Department records. Zenith sued. The lawsuit that followed would run, in one form or another, for the next 16 years. It would reach the Supreme Court of the United States twice. It would consume, by conservative estimates, more than $100 million of Zenith's legal budget, a figure that in today's currency would be equivalent to well over $200 million. It would end, in 1986, in a defeat that would be studied in American law schools for the next 40 years, and that would effectively close the American anti-dumping regime as a remedy for the domestic television industry. By the time it was over, Zenith would be the last American-owned television manufacturer standing. Every other American producer would have exited the business, or been sold to a foreign owner, or gone bankrupt. The case was formally titled INRI Japanese Electronic Products Antitrust Litigation. It was heard in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania before Judge Edward R. Becker. The trial phase alone lasted 8 months. The trial record, when it was finally certified for appeal, ran to more than 100,000 pages, which was, at the time, believed to be one of the largest records ever assembled in a private American antitrust case. The Japanese manufacturers, 7 of them, were represented by more than 20 law firms. Zenith and its co-plaintiff, a Philadelphia company called National Union Electric Corporation, were represented by 3. The theory of the case, as developed by Zenith's lawyers over more than a decade of pre-trial discovery, was that the 7 Japanese electronics manufacturers had conspired. meeting under the auspices of a trade association, to fix the export prices of televisions sold in the United States at levels below the prices they charged in Japan, with the specific intent of driving the American manufacturers out of business. The evidence for this alleged conspiracy included the minutes of what the plaintiffs called the 10-day rule meetings, at which the Japanese manufacturers were said to have agreed on minimum export prices, and a document known within the case as the Okura Group Memorandum, which appeared, according to the plaintiffs, to describe a market allocation scheme for the American market. The Japanese defendants argued that the meetings had not occurred as the plaintiffs described them, or, in the alternative, that they had been meetings called to comply with, rather than to violate, Japanese export regulations administered by the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Judge Becker, after 8 months of trial and years of pre-trial motions, granted summary judgment for the defendants. He ruled that the evidence taken as a whole was insufficient to permit a reasonable jury to find the conspiracy the plaintiffs had alleged. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals reversed him. The Third Circuit held that summary judgment was inappropriate in a case where the evidentiary record was as extensive as this one, and where the plaintiffs had produced at least some evidence tending to support each element of their claim. The Supreme Court, in 1986, reversed the Third Circuit. Justice Lewis Powell, writing for a 5-4 majority in the case now known to every American antitrust lawyer as Matsushita Electric Industrial Company versus Zenith Radio Corporation, held that the alleged conspiracy was economically implausible on its face. No rational manufacturer, Justice Powell reasoned, would sell below cost for 20 years on the mere hope of eventually recouping his losses. The predatory pricing scheme the plaintiffs described would require the Japanese manufacturers to sustain losses for a period so long, and on a scale so large, that no rational company would undertake it. And because the alleged conspiracy was economically implausible, the evidence supporting it had to be evaluated more stringently on summary judgment than would ordinarily be the case. The court remanded. The case was retried on narrower grounds. Zenith lost again. The Matsushita decision changed American antitrust law. It made it substantially more difficult for plaintiffs in predatory pricing cases to survive summary judgment, and it did so by importing an economic plausibility test into what had until then been a straightforward evidentiary inquiry. Whether Justice Powell's economic reasoning was correct remains disputed among antitrust scholars. What is not disputed is the effect. Since Matsushita, no American manufacturer of consumer electronics has successfully brought a private anti-dumping-based antitrust case of comparable scope. The remedy that Zenith spent 16 years and $100 million pursuing was, at the moment of its final defeat, effectively taken off the table for every American company that might have tried to follow. The commander was not there to see any of it. Eugene F. McDonald Jr. had died in 1958 at the age of 72. He had built the company that fought the case. He had chosen the men who filed it. He would not, on the evidence of his own writings, have recognized the legal and political country in which his successors lost it. While the lawsuit ground on through the American federal courts, the underlying economic reality it was designed to address had already begun to change on the ground. By the late 1970s, the question facing Zenith's board was no longer whether the Japanese manufacturers were selling below cost. The question was what an American television manufacturer, paying American wages in American factories, could do to compete with foreign manufacturers who were not. The Japanese answer, which by the late 1970s had become the industry standard answer, was automation. Where Zenith built its color televisions on hand-wired chassis assembled by American workers at benches in Chicago and Melrose Park, Matsushita built its televisions on printed circuit boards populated by automated component insertion machines in factories in Japan and, increasingly, in the export processing zones of Taiwan and Singapore. The automated boards were cheaper to build. By the early 1980s, According to the reporting of Consumer Reports and other trade publications of the period, they had also become more reliable than the hand-wired boards that had been Zenith's competitive advantage for 30 years. Automated insertion produced solder joints of a consistency that no human hand wirer, however skilled or however experienced, could consistently match. The service call rate on a Panasonic color television by the early 1980s was substantially lower than the service call rate on a comparable Zenith. The handcrafted chassis had become the handcrafted liability. And the commander's principle, that quality was built in by hand and that automation was a compromise, had run into a technological reality that the commander had not, in his lifetime, faced. Automation, at least in the manufacture of circuit boards, now produced higher quality than hand assembly. Zenith responded. In 1977, the company opened its first television assembly plant in Reynosa, Mexico, across the Rio Grande from McAllen, Texas. In 1979, a second Mexican plant at Matamoros. By the mid-1980s, more than half of Zenith's color television sets were being assembled in Mexico from components shipped in from the American plants. The picture tube still came from Melrose Park. The shadow masks still came from Rowland. Some final assembly still took place in Chicago. But the labor-intensive work, the part where a person sat at a bench for 8 hours inserting components into a chassis, had moved south of the border. This was called, at the time, the Maquiladora strategy, after the Mexican legal category that permitted foreign-owned assembly plants to import components duty-free for assembly and re-export. The strategy kept Zenith in business for another decade. It did not, in the end, save the American plants. The Sioux City cabinet plant, which had made wooden cabinets for Zenith consoles since the 1950s, was closed at some point in the early 1990s. The Springfield plant, which had made speakers, was closed in the same period. The closing dates should be verified against Zenith's corporate filings. The last color television built entirely in the United States, according to Zenith's own records at the time, rolled off the Melrose Park line in the early 1990s. The date, the model, and the final destination have been given differently in different accounts, and should be verified before any specific claim is made on air. The 1980s, for Zenith, were a long, slow financial bleed. The company had reported its last unambiguously good year in 1976. It lost money in 1977 and again in 1978. It made a small profit in 1979. Then, with 2 brief exceptions, it lost money every year for the next 15 years. The stock price, which had touched $60 a share during the peak year of 1966, was trading below $5 by the early 1990s. The dividend was suspended. The credit rating was downgraded, then downgraded again. The board explored and rejected a sale of the consumer electronics business to the French company Thomson in the late 1980s. It explored and rejected a joint venture with AT&T. It sold its computer monitor business to focus on television. Nothing worked. The one large bet that Zenith did place in this period, and that at the time looked as though it might yet save the company from the slow financial bleed of the previous decade, was on high-definition television. In the late 1980s, the Federal Communications Commission had begun a formal process to select a new American broadcast standard for high-definition transmission, one that would eventually replace the analog standard that had governed American television broadcasting since the late 1940s. The process was, from the outset, understood within the American electronics industry to be one of the most consequential regulatory proceedings of the decade. Whoever held the essential patents on the new standard would collect royalties on every high-definition television set sold in the United States, and on much of the associated broadcast equipment for the 20-year life of those patents. Several consortia formed to develop competing proposals. Zenith, alone among the major American consumer electronics companies still operating in 1988, entered the competition as a serious contender. It did so in a research partnership with AT&T, whose Bell Laboratories division brought signal processing expertise that Zenith's own engineering staff, however capable, did not fully possess in-house. The partnership was formalized in 1990. Over the following 3 years, the joint team developed one of the leading technical proposals in the FCC proceeding, focused in particular on the transmission and modulation technology that would carry the digital signal from the broadcaster to the antenna on the viewer's roof. In 1993, after several years of technical comparison and political negotiation among the competing groups, the FCC's advisory committee recommended, and the Commission accepted, a merged proposal that combined elements from several of the competing systems. The Zenith and AT&T contribution, particularly its work on the transmission layer, was selected as the basis for what became the American Advanced Television Systems Committee standard, formally adopted in 1996. Zenith held, as a result, key patents on the transmission technology that would be embedded in every ATSC-compliant television and every ATSC broadcast transmitter sold in the United States. The company's engineers believed and told the Zenith board that the patent royalties flowing from the new standard would, over the following 2 decades, generate hundreds of millions of dollars in high-margin revenue. This was not, on the engineering assumptions of the period, an optimistic projection. It was, if anything, a conservative one. The American television market was very large. The transition to digital broadcasting was, once mandated, essentially non-optional. Every household that continued to receive over-the-air television would, sooner or later, need a set that implemented the new standard. Every royalty paid on every one of those sets would, under the licensing arrangements Zenith had negotiated, flow back through the Glenview headquarters to the corporate account. On paper, in 1993, the HTV bet looked as though it might, on its own, refinance the company for the next quarter century. They were right about the money. They were wrong about the company that would eventually collect it. The transition to digital television in the United States took longer than anyone at Zenith had expected in 1993, and it required a further decade of expensive engineering work that Zenith, in its diminished financial state, could not comfortably fund. The company continued to lose money on its television manufacturing operations, and the projected patent royalties, when they eventually began to flow, would flow to whoever owned Zenith at the time. By the early 1990s, the board's calculation had become brutally simple. Zenith needed capital, and no American investor was willing to provide it on terms the board could accept. The Korean company Goldstar Company Limited, later renamed Elg Electronics, had bought its first block of Zenith shares in 1991. It was not, at that point, publicly signaling an intent to acquire the whole company. It bought approximately 5%. It bought more in 1993, bringing its stake to slightly under 12%. By this point, Goldstar had representation on the Zenith board and was participating in the strategic conversations about what the company should do next. In the summer of 1995, Goldstar offered to buy the rest. The board discussed the offer. It considered the alternatives. It did not, in the record that has become public, find any alternative that was materially better. On the 6th of July 1995, the deal was announced. The purchase price was approximately $351 million for the shares Goldstar did not already own. The transaction closed later that year. The company that Eugene F. McDonald Jr. had incorporated in Chicago in 1923 and that had employed 36,000 Americans at its peak was now a wholly owned subsidiary of a Korean electronics manufacturer. For 3 years, from the closing of the acquisition in late 1995 until the summer of 1998, Goldstar operated Zenith as a going American concern. The Melrose Park plant remained open. The American engineering staff, several thousand strong, remained largely intact. The headquarters remained in Glenview, Illinois. A number of new senior executives arrived from Seoul, but the day-to-day management of the American operations was, to a substantial degree, left in the hands of the American managers who had been running them before the sale. This was not, in 1995 and 1996, an unusual arrangement for a foreign acquisition of a large American company. It was, in fact, the conventional playbook. The foreign owner would take a period of 2 to 3 years to understand the American operations, to identify the parts of the business that could be integrated with the parent company's global operations, and to decide which of the acquired facilities would be retained and which would be closed. Everyone at Zenith, from the board down to the picture tube line at Melrose Park, understood that this was the process that was now underway. What no one at Zenith knew in 1995 was how the process would end. It ended in 1998. In the summer of that year, Goldstar, by then renamed Elg Electronics, announced that the Melrose Park picture tube operation would be closed. The reasons given in the press releases and in the interviews the company gave at the time were the reasons that would have been given by any rational owner of any high-cost American manufacturing facility in 1998. The Melrose Park plant, however historically significant, could not be made cost-competitive with the LG picture tube facilities in Mexico and Korea. The American picture tubes cost substantially more to make than the equivalent tubes from the LG plants abroad. The differential, per tube, was not large in absolute terms. Across the volume the plant was producing, it was decisive. The plant closed over the course of several months in late 1998. Approximately 1,200 workers were laid off, though the figure has been given differently in different accounts and should be verified against LG's disclosures at the time. Severance packages were offered. Pension obligations for workers who had qualified for them were honored. The picture tube line, the machinery that had produced tens of millions of cathode ray tubes for American living rooms over the course of half a century, was dismantled. Some of it was sold to other manufacturers, some of it was sold for scrap. The building stood empty for approximately 5 years and was then demolished. The site, at the corner of 25th Avenue and North Avenue in Melrose Park, Illinois, is now, according to publicly available satellite imagery, occupied by a shopping center. The Chicago plant on the north side, where final assembly had taken place for decades, had been closed at some point in the late 1990s and was later sold. The Rowland Shadow Mask plant was closed in the same period. The Sioux City cabinet plant and the Springfield speaker plant had already been closed earlier in the decade. By the end of 1998, Zenith Electronics Corporation, as a manufacturer of televisions in the United States, no longer existed. The name continued. The corporate entity continued as an American subsidiary of Elg. The physical apparatus of American television manufacturing, which had employed tens of thousands of Americans in the middle of the 20th century, did not. Eugene F. McDonald Jr. would have hated the sale to Goldstar. He said so, in effect, for the last 30 years of his life. Asked in 1952, at a shareholder meeting in Chicago, whether Zenith would consider licensing its designs to foreign manufacturers, the commander had replied, according to the transcript, in 2 sentences. "The quality goes in before the name goes on," he said. "We do not put our name on other people's work." Where the commander had built for the American market, his successors built for the world market, and the world market did not, in the end, want what Zenith built at the prices Zenith needed to charge to build it in America. Where the commander had insisted that every set be assembled by American workers in American plants, his successors moved assembly to Mexico, then to Korea, then to China, on the reasonable and correct calculation that the alternative was to move it nowhere and to go out of business. Where the commander had refused, throughout his life, to build a set with a printed circuit board because he believed printed circuits were less reliable than hand wiring, his successors adopted printed circuits in the mid-1970s, roughly 10 years after the technology had become the industry standard, and Zenith never fully recovered the reliability gap that decade of delay had opened. None of this was the commander's fault. He had been dead for 37 years when the sale to Goldstar closed. The company he had left in 1958 had 36,000 American employees, a dominant position in radio, a fast-growing position in television, and a balance sheet that would sustain a decade of research and development on almost any project the board chose to pursue. What the commander had not left, because it could not be left, was a plan for what Zenith should do when the Japanese arrived. Nobody in the American consumer electronics industry had that plan. Nobody survived without it. ICA, the company that had invented American commercial television, was sold to General Electric in the mid-1980s, and its consumer electronics business handed to the French company Thomson shortly after. Motorola sold its television business to Matsushita in the mid-1970s. Magnavox, Sylvania, Philco, Admiral, Emerson, all gone or sold, one after another, through the 1970s and 80s. Zenith was simply the last. The engineers who worked at Zenith in the 1980s and 1990s, the men and women who kept the picture tubes rolling off the Melrose Park line for as long as anyone rolled picture tubes off any American line, speak of the commander now as a distant and slightly mythical figure. Most of them had never met him. He had been dead for a decade or more by the time they started at Zenith. They knew him through the stories the older workers told, and through the framed photographs in the corporate offices, and through the phrase, still repeated on the factory floor decades after his death, about quality and names. What the commander had built, in the end, was not any particular radio or television, and not the Melrose Park plant, and not even the corporate entity that carried his signature. What he had built was a way of thinking about American manufacturing that assumed the American market and the American workforce would always be, in some fundamental sense, sufficient. The market would buy quality. The workforce would build it. The company that stood in the middle and honored both would prosper. This assumption held for Zenith and for the American consumer electronics industry as a whole for approximately 40 years. Then it stopped holding. The commander did not live to see it stop. He died in 1958 at 72. He was buried in Chicago. His boat, the Mizpah, had been sold out of the family more than a decade earlier, and would eventually, according to widely repeated accounts that should be verified, end its working life scuttled off the coast of Florida, where it now serves as an artificial reef for recreational divers. The company he had built would outlive him by 37 years as an independent American concern. Its factories would outlive him by 40. The name would outlive him still. Drive out to Melrose Park today on a Tuesday evening in summer and look at the corner of 25th Avenue and North Avenue. There is a shopping center. There is a large chain retailer, and a parking lot, and a row of smaller storefronts. Behind them, where the picture tube plant once stood, there is a loading dock and more parking. You can, on the publicly available satellite imagery, trace the approximate footprint of the demolished building. On the ground, walking the site in person, you can see nothing at all. The building is gone. The tube line is gone. The workers, most of them, are gone. The Chicago plant on the north side, where final assembly had taken place for decades, was sold in the years after the American manufacturing operations wound down and repurposed for other uses. The Rowland Shadow Mask plant in the western suburbs was closed at the end of the 1990s. The Sioux City cabinet plant is, according to publicly available records, now used for other industrial purposes. The Springfield speaker plant was closed in the early 1990s. The Glenview headquarters, where the last several hundred American employees of Zenith Electronics still work, occupies a much smaller building than the one the company operated at its peak. The sign in the lobby, according to recent visitors, reads LG Electronics USA. The word Zenith on the exterior signage is not prominent. Had any one of the 1,200 workers laid off from the Melrose Park plant in 1998 kept a single share of Zenith stock from the peak year of 1966, that share, adjusted for the LG acquisition and the subsequent history of the parent company's stock, would today be worth some small amount that would not, in any meaningful sense, have compensated the worker for the loss of the job. The pension obligations for the workers who had qualified for them were honoured by LG under the terms of the acquisition. The healthcare arrangements for the workers who had not yet qualified were, in most cases, not maintained on the terms that had existed before the closing. The workers who found new employment, and most of them eventually did, generally found it at wages substantially below what Zenith had paid. The name Zenith is still, in the year of this recording, printed on the plastic bezels of televisions sold in American electronics stores and on the shelves of large national retailers. The televisions are manufactured, under contract, in factories in Mexico and in several countries across Asia to specifications set by LG Electronics in Seoul. They are, by every objective measure that a consumer electronics engineer would use, better televisions than any set Zenith ever built at Melrose Park. The pictures are sharper, the colors are more accurate. The sets weigh a fraction of what a comparable console weighed in 1966. They fail less often, and when they fail, they are generally not repaired at all. They are discarded, and a new one is bought because the new one costs, adjusted for inflation, a small fraction of what a comparable Zenith set cost in 1948, or in 1966, or in any year in which the picture tubes were still being made on the north side of Chicago. This is the trade that was made in slow motion over the 4 decades between the arrival of the first Japanese container ships at the port of Long Beach and the closing of the last American picture tube plant in the summer of 1998. The country got cheaper televisions. The country got better televisions. The country got, over time, a consumer electronics market so thoroughly globalized that no American manufacturer would credibly attempt to re-enter it. The country gave up, in exchange, the factories that had built those televisions for half a century, and the workers who had worked at benches on those factory floors for 30 and 40-year careers, and the neighborhoods on the north side of Chicago and in the western suburbs where those workers had raised families and paid mortgages and buried parents. The bargain was not announced. No vote was taken. It happened one plant closure at a time, one layoff notice at a time, one shift walking out on its last Friday over the course of a generation. Whether that was a good trade, on balance, is a question this documentary will not attempt to answer. Economists have argued it for 40 years and continue to argue it now. What can be said is that the trade was, in some real sense, made without ever being explicitly proposed to the people who paid the highest price for it, the men and women who had worked the Melrose Park line. Some of them, for their entire adult working lives, answered the question for themselves, one at a time, in the months and years after they walked out of the building for the last time. Some of them found other work. Some of them retired earlier than they had planned to. Some of them did not, in any recognizable sense, recover from it at all. The commander is buried in Chicago. The stone gives his name, his rank, and his dates. So far as any public account records, it does not mention Zenith. The company outlived him by 37 years as an American concern. The Melrose Park plant outlived him by 40. The name outlives him still, printed in small letters on the plastic bezels of televisions built in countries he never visited, by workers he would not have recognized, for a market he would not, in any meaningful sense, have understood. The quality, as he used to say, goes in before the name goes on. The name is what is left. The cathedral is gone. If you had been one of the workers walking out of the Melrose Park plant on the last day, what would you have carried with you? Tell me in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, subscribe.